it's a little bit noisy out here because even though it's November in Texas and these vines are about to go dormant doesn't mean dead. There's still a lot of work going on inside these vines, and there's a lot of work going on to take care of these vines. So y'all just have to bear with us as we've got all of these sounds today. But it's really important that if you're really going to understand what Jesus was saying to us, not just to his disciples, but to us, those that are still following and discipling after him, what he meant when he was saying in John chapter 15, the first 11 verses, I am the vine, you are the branches. We must get an understanding of what that really looks like by looking at these actual grapevines. You may have vines that grow in your backyard. There's all kinds of vines, honeysuckle vines. Those things will pretty much grow anywhere. They grow in lots of different settings and they don't require that much tending. But grapevines are a different story. They are very difficult to get good fruit from unless they have constant tending. And so where they are planted, how they are planted, the pruning, everything that we're going to look at as we go through this study matters. And it has to matter with who we are too, because Jesus chose of all the plants on earth to compare us, his followers, to, he chose a vine. So today I want to just take you through the basic anatomy of a vine, because we're going to be out here week after week as we go through the seasons of the vine. And it's important that you kind of have a little bit of a viticulture lesson in the parts of the vine. So when Jesus is speaking to his disciples, it's just before his crucifixion. They don't know what's going to happen, but he does. And so he uses this metaphor with them, a metaphor that would have been very well known to them, because in ancient Israel, as in most of the ancient world, grapevines and vineyards were a common occurrence, especially along the Mediterranean, because the climate is just well suited to grow grapes and to grow olives. And we'll talk a little bit more about the olive tree as we get into our study and the comparison between those, and how Jesus really uses both of those plants to talk about us and our relationship with him and how it should be. But for him to reference to the disciples that I am the vine, you are the branches, and my Father is the vine dresser, there would have been a basic foundation of knowledge that he didn't have to discuss, because they would have been around vineyards. They would have known the basic care of vineyards. But we don't get that today, because unless you live in Napa Valley or Europe in the wine regions, you probably don't know. Maybe if you're in Texas, we're kind of in the northern part of the hill country, which is really becoming the wine country of this state. You might be familiar, but for the vast majority of us, we don't know. And before my husband and I decided to plant this vineyard, I didn't know either. So we're going to dive in just a little bit to have a kind of an overview of the anatomy of the vine. So here we have a grapevine. This particular varietal is Tempranillo. It originated in Spain, and it loves the Texas heat and the Texas summer. So it does really well here. These vines are now about to be in their 8th leaf, which means they have gone through 8 growing seasons. And as I said, it's about time for the dormant season. We've already had harvest here in Texas. That happens anywhere from late July to early September. So these have already had the fruit of their growing season taken off. And now, as you can see, some of them, the leaves are beginning to drop and they're beginning to go into their dormant season. So when we look at the vine, and Jesus said, my Father is the vine dresser. That's the tender of the vineyards. He's the one that comes in and he knows each vine separately. He looks at each vine as an individual. When my husband comes out here and our crew that helps us manage this vineyard comes through and they do the pruning, they do the harvesting, there's no mass anything done here with machines. You'll hear engines over there, but there's mowing going on and some other things that they're using to kind of move throughout the vineyard. But when we deal with these vineyards as the vine dressers, we're hands-on, literally. with these vines. So God is the vine dresser. Jesus says, I am the vine. That's this portion of the vine, from the trunk and the root system below that you see, all the way up to this thicker portion of what you see here. And so this is the constant. This never changes. There are parts of this that will be pruned back as we go through the way we tend our vineyard. But this vine, as the years go on, it gets thicker and wider. It gets more scarred. And there's beautiful things that God has taught me about the scars. So as it gets a few more months in and we really dig into the dormant season, we're going to be coming back and looking at how weather worn these are, because the storms and the winds and everything that come through the seasons of the life of this vine have made their mark on it. And we could say, if we look back at our lives, the storms and the seasons and the winds and all of those things that kind of toss and turn our lives, we have scars to bear from that. But there's beauty that comes from those scars. So when we look at how we have chosen to lay out these vines, when the vine is planted, it's literally one tiny little stick that is rooted in the ground and then will grow up. As it reaches the level to where the main trunk would branch into two, the vine dresser chooses which portion of the vine will go this way and which portion of the vine will go that way. And so he lays it out. Literally, you see these little green, I say he or she, lays it out so that it's tethered to these wires. And this trellis system is what helps it to stay firm, so that it trains the vine. Then from the vine, you get these shoots, and they are called shoots, but this is what Jesus is talking about when he says the branches. But if you're following along and reading the blog that goes along with this week's teaching, you'll know that there's the reference in Isaiah. There's also the reference in Psalm 80 where God talks about the shoot. And the shoot that he mentions is a branch, okay? So you'll hear and see that terminology kind of back and forth. So these branches correlate to us. So God is the vine dresser, the tender of the vineyard. Jesus is the vine itself, and we are the branches. And so these branches, as you see right now, they're losing their leaves, as I talked about. The fruit has been taken off. And about February, we will come in and we will start the first of the pruning series on these vines. So there's a little known fact to most of us out in the world that is very commonly known if you are in the grape growing winemaking business. And that's a part of the history really of what happened to a large portion of grapevines during the late 1800s. It used to be that different varieties had their own root stock, and the root would be everything from, it's not as easy to see on this one, but you see this kind of, it bulges right here. There's kind of a bulb. And so the root is everything from that bulge down into the ground as the roots dig deeper into the soil. And again, we'll talk later on in the series about the right conditions for the soil, because grapevines don't just grow anywhere. There's really very much of an intentional placement into the soil and the care of the soil of the vines that are what give the branches the right kind of nutrients so that they bear the good fruit. And it has a lot of correlation to what we're doing in our lives and where we choose to dig into the dirt, and how God really says, as the vine dresser, I've planted you in this soil for this season, for this reason. And so there's so much to literally dig into, but to really figuratively understand as we look at it. But going back to our history lesson, in the 1850s, Here in Texas, believe it or not, there was a researcher of vines who figured out that Texas vines grown here had a natural resistance to a disease that was infecting a lot of vines, and that had in fact infected a lot of vines in vineyards across the world. And so they shipped some of this rootstock over to Europe so that they could study it there, they could plant it in the soil there and see if those vines that had this resistance to a well-known disease would do well in Europe as well. Well, what they didn't know is this disease was actually carried by a little insect. And when they shipped those vines over there, they also shipped the insects. And so the insects began to infiltrate the vineyards in France, in Italy, kind of swept across the wine growing world of Europe, and became known as the Great Blight of 1850, as you had vineyard after vineyard just being destroyed by this infection. So knowing that in Texas, where unfortunately the disease had originated, they had the answer though, because these Texas vines had a resistance to that. They wanted to know if you took the root stock and you grafted other vines on it, would those other vines take on the quality of that root system in being immune and resistant to that disease? And they found out that it did. So now, when you go pretty much anywhere in the world, the actual root stock of any vine is the same. It's the same origin. And they all come from Texas. And if you're a Texan, you know we take great pride in that, even though we kind of caused the problem, but we fixed the problem too. There's a great lesson to be learned in the fact that we are grafted in. The grafting process occurs when you take a shoot or a branch while it's still green, okay, while it still has life in it. Literally, they will go to another vine, they will take a knife, they will slit and create, they will pierce the vine, they will lay the open part of where the incision happened from the shoot and in the vine, and then they will wrap it around, holding it and binding that shoot to the vine so that it's able to exchange fluids, exchange nutrients, and one begins to grow into the other. And so all of these vines are grafted on the same rootstock, even though there's 3 different varietals in this one vineyard. They share the origin of the same rootstock. God has taken and grafted all of us into the same root, and it is the blood of Jesus and the binding of ourselves to that vine. That's what abide means, to stay constantly connected to, that actually gives us the life we have in Christ and gives us the strength and support we have to carry out His calling for us, which is to bear the fruit of the Spirit, and to have that which will build His kingdom. So I hope this first little lesson in the vineyard and getting a greater understanding of the anatomy of the vine helps you begin to see what Jesus wants to begin to teach us about Him, the true vine, and us who abide with Him. I'll see you next time.